Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kevin Hancock, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. We're going to give people who may be straggling a little bit 2 minutes to go ahead and join up. So we're going to start the webinar at 2 minutes past the hour. Please sit tight, and I'll give another reminder at 1 minute past just to give everybody a countdown. Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Hancock. For those of you who just joined us and were wondering about the silence, just nothing to worry about. We're going to get started in 1 minute, just giving a chance for those folks who are joining a little late to go ahead and get joined up. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kevin Hancock, and thanks for joining us today for Exostar sponsored webinar, An Affordable Solution for CMMC Readiness. Before we get started, just wanted to cover a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is scheduled to last from 45 minutes to an hour. It includes a Q&A session that's held at the end. The large portion of today's event is dedicated to answering pressing questions from the audience. Speakers will be answering questions that have been submitted prior to today's event. In case there is an outage during the session, please wait for a minute and then just go ahead and refresh the page. For your convenience, there's a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms, acronyms, and initializations that will be referenced during today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be available on demand via the Exostar resource library. That can be found at www.exostar.com/resources. Anytime post the event, you can also reach the replay of the webinar. See the replay of this webinar by referencing the YouTube link you received in the initial email. If you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts or request a copy of this slide deck, please reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com or use the live chat feature at www.exostar.com. So I'm really happy today to be joined on today's webinar by the speakers Bob Metzger, Richard Wakeman, and Vijay Takanti. They'll be each covering a section of today's webinar, and we're going to go ahead and start with Bob Metzger.
Thank you. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no problem, Bob. Just wanted to cover the agenda real quick, and then I'll pass it back over to you. So the agenda we'll cover, as I mentioned before, is Bob Metzger covering the challenges of implementing CMMC2. Richard Wakeman will cover the Microsoft 365 GCC High features and adoption for the DIB. And then Vijay Takanti will be covering Exostar's managed Microsoft 365 for CMMC specifically. We'll then do that Q&A session, and we'll also throw up an exit poll for you that we'd love to get your feedback on, because we do use that feedback both to let us know how we're doing, but also to give us some ideas for topics that you might be interested in the future. So Bob, with that, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. It's certainly my privilege to join this group and speak on this most important topic, where I have maybe more history than some might suspect. Next slide, please. So where are we today? Well, I'm going to go back behind the slide a little bit, because I looked at some of the history, and it may amaze and surprise some of you and depress others, that it's that the first rule on the protection of unclassified controlled technical information was promulgated on November 18th, 2013. So we're nearing the 9-year anniversary of when cyber compliance became something that was included in the DFARS and showing up in your contracts. It has been a long struggle. Progress has been made, but we are far from achieving the security that we wish for the DIB, and we have encountered continuing frustration in finding ways to do it affordably and practicably. So, we all know that CMMC 2.0 is in process. We all need to remember that there are 3 critical regulations that remain in place and in force. 7012, of course, is the basic safeguarding rule. That's the one that requires adequate security for all CDI on all covered contractor information systems. Well, you notice just that simple description focuses on premises systems. The theme of this program, and one that I've written about extensively, is that asking thousands of companies to individually address 100+ requirements for their particular premises systems is a way of increasing complication, potentially confusion, certainly dismay, and inevitably cost. So I've been saying for quite a few years that we need to be thinking about smarter ways, using leveraged resources to get the job done at individual companies without imposing demands that they change all of themselves as an enterprise. Now, notice that I've chosen to describe adequate security, or to reference the definition. It means protective measures that are commensurate with the consequences and probability of loss, misuse, or unauthorized access to or modification of information. Well, sometimes we tend to focus only on NIST SP 800-171 and its 110 requirements. And of course, those are key to compliance, and we all need to be compliant. But there's always been a distinction between compliance and what is in fact adequate security. That we should be alert that risk-informed judgments might cause us to add things or do things differently, or look for other or improved measures to provide adequate security, perhaps even above and beyond the compliance measures that may be dictated by 171. And one of the things that I like about cloud-delivered solutions is an obvious one. There's a huge amount of people and resources, technical talent at the major CSPs, among them Microsoft, that are dedicated as a matter of central importance to their businesses to constantly be looking at the threat environment, finding new vulnerabilities, finding means to address them, and increasing and improving and adding services that respond not just to those 110 requirements, but also to the real world demands for adequate security, where the nature of the threats could be quite different than those that were contemplated way back in 2015 when 171 was first published. We also are still subject to DFAR 7019 and 7020, and probably everyone listening here knows what those mean. Those do require that you have a system security plan, that you perform a self-assessment, and that you post the results of your self-assessment on the SIPR score. They're also SIPR system. You're also supposed to state when you're going to close any gaps. In addition, the 7020 clause means that you give consent for the government to conduct a medium assessment or a high assessment. There's been about 300 high assessments done by the DIPCAC unit of DCMA. And now they have just started a program where they are calling more or less at random companies that have a SIPR submission. And a medium assessment is done to see whether they have any documentation behind it. And I say this because, even though we won't see the CMMC 2.0 rules become effective for a year and perhaps longer, there are still obligations that are imposed upon companies. There are still consequences of failing to secure your information. And of course, there are the threats that DoD is trying to help protect against for their interest also are threats to your business, your enterprise, and your information and your IP. So the CMMC 2.0 rules are now presently expected to come out as another interim rule in the spring of 2023 and becoming effective in 60 days later. And we know that most of us are focused on level 2, where you have controlled and classified information, where you're expected to satisfy the assessment requirements based upon 171. And DoD has said that this affects 80,000 companies. That's a lot, and maybe only a small portion of them might not have to have a third-party assessment. Just in the last couple of days, NIST has announced an intent to revise 800-171. First published in 2015. It's about time. We need that to be revised. It's kind of behind the curve of threat vulnerabilities and responses. And it's important for all of us to recognize that as we plot our course towards compliance and security, we want to be thinking about measures that are relevant to the contemporary threat landscape, and which will anticipate whatever changes might come in 171, because it's certainly possible, if not likely in my judgment, that when CMMC 2.0 arrives, that it will, at a point not far from its effectiveness, start to invoke level 3 of SB 800-171. Next slide, please. I've been saying for some time that compliance is an easy thing to talk about, and there's a million people in market out there going to help you. But from the standpoint of the business owner, the CMMC compliance requirement is enterprise critical. When the time comes that you're subject to an assessment and you require a certification, you may be ineligible or would be ineligible to propose or to hold a contract if you can't get past that assessment and get the certification. And it's not just your business. Prime contractors on many important programs depend on your continuing participation. And therefore, primes have a keen interest in making sure that every level of their supply chain finds an affordable and secure, successful means to secure the sensitive information, CDI, which is at the heart of regulation. We know that there's going to be assessments that have 110 stated requirements, but those of you who have looked at the assessment guide may count that there are as many as 350 or so things that are raised as evaluation objectives or determination statements. Not all of those things actually need to be assessed. But, when you look at the assembly going from 171, 171A, CMMC level 2, its assessment guide, it's a complex array. And asking all 80,000 companies to find the way to deal with these things individually so that they will pass this assessment, eventual C3PO assessments. We do know in the new regulations that DoD is going to allow POAMs, but not for the tough stuff. If it's a 5-point item on the DoD assessment methodology, you're not going to get a POAM. And the head of DIPCAC, John Ellis, has said very clearly that if you're thinking that you can get started with this when the rule becomes published or effective, it's a mistake. It's just too hard for many companies. And that means you've got to be acting now, making investment decisions now, thinking of strategies and architecture now. And that's why what Microsoft here and Exostar offer is so timely. I have said for some years that having a CMMC ecosystem doesn't mean it is successful unless there are ways to comply and be secure that are cost effective. And that has been an elusive goal. Next slide. I don't want to take too much time here, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. When DoD announced CMMC 2.0 in November 21, Jesse Salazar, who was then the head of industrial policy, said that an objective was to simplify the standard and provide additional clarity. I think that's more aspirational than reality. My sense is that the system, the ecosystem, has become more complex and seemingly more arduous, with the passage of time. And we've been told by the government that this new rule package is quite large and complex. It is not going to make things simpler. We also know that the threat landscape has not improved. We barely can go a week without some warning from MI5 or the FBI that the Chinese continue to steal information at truly shocking rates. And you are the targets of their information theft, especially those of you who are in the middle and lower tiers of the supply chain are likely to be less secure than those at higher tiers. So what's going to happen? Well, some companies will drop out. Other companies will misrepresent their status either by SIPRs or claim that they do things that they're not, or promise that they're going to close gaps when they haven't, all of which presents not only a compliance, but an enforcement risk to you. But we can't ease the cyber requirements because the threat is too great. And this leads me to a fundamental and very simple proposition. DoD has to facilitate means by which thousands of companies can have actual and adequate security in compliance with 171, but do it more affordably than forcing each of these 80,000 companies through a maze of 110 requirements with all kinds of other expectations of determination statements and evaluation criteria. Next slide, please. Well, I'm gonna jump through these pretty quickly. If you look at these three quotes, one of which says this problem is particularly acute among mid-sized companies, and others says that all the effort of 171 is directed to on-premises information systems. And then on the last slide, it says that federal information initiatives to protect CUI should be cloud cognizant, cloud receptive. Next slide. Those are things that I wrote in a paper that Exostar commissioned that was published in September 2016. I said then there was a better way to do this, and this was to focus on using the cloud, where there was so much innovation and investment in security, and essentially finding ways to promote and facilitate the use of commercially provided, cloud-enabled security as a service, which I said was a secure, scalable, and flexible means for the entire supply chain to meet and exceed the objectives of 171 and to sustain security in a dynamic environment. Well, in the approximately 6 years since I wrote that paper, I'm only more convinced of the truth of all of those things. And I'm really delighted to see this example of industry progress in providing such a solution. I'll mention one more thing and skip the present slide for the moment. Many of you may have read statements by David McEwen of the DoD CIO office. Back in April, he said, and I'm quoting, "In the CMMC realm, rather than go out and assess each and every network of our industry partners, I'm keen on establishing some sort of cloud services that either achieve many of the 110 controls in NIST 800-171 or all of them." That's good. I mean, what we're trying to do is consistent with that. But he went on to say this: "The offerings would allow our industry partners who consume sensitive DoD information to store our data and safeguard our data without us having to go out onto your networks. I'm looking for innovative solutions and a pathway where I can certify that you meet 85 out of 110 of these controls and that you're out there and consumable by others, and we will give credit for that." Well, there's some of that concept that I like a lot, but embedded in this is a notion, a proposition I think DoD still holds, that maybe it should offer enclaves, that it should create some instrumentality where it will hold the data that it provides you, which is its data. And the notion is that instead of looking to industry, which to me has proven itself to be highly capable and agile in cloud security and cloud services, somehow DoD is going to offer something itself that is different and better and more attractive. I don't believe it. Moreover, I think that as DoD examines it, even if it was technically feasible, they will find that offering a function where commercial organizations already provide it, raises a number of legal and regulatory complications. And they're likely to find that many companies in the DIB are reluctant to have the DoD hosting their information and by implication monitoring some of their security. That's why we want to look upon what the private sector can do. And now with what Microsoft and Exostar will say, we're going to get to hear and see what's been accomplished. I'll skip my last 2 slides and let's go on to the next speaker.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. So Richard, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. Please welcome Richard Wakeman from Microsoft as he goes ahead and kicks it off.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. Let's see if I can get this the screen shared here properly.
Got it.
Excellent. Richard Wakeman, the Chief Architect for our Aerospace and Defense team at Microsoft. So our team is structured to work exclusively with the defense industrial base. So we focus heavily on the solutions that are available especially for the U.S. Defense industrial base as well as the U.S. government. This includes our government clouds like Azure Government and Microsoft 365 Government GCC High, and compliance, of course, that surrounds it. Many of you have probably come across me in previous webinars or in person, just in my role working within various different industry working groups for the CMMC, and super excited about this solution that we have here today. So, if you go back and look at the very first set of conversations that we had around positioning a CMMC or DFAR 7012 compliant solution and protection of controlled unclassified information, we really introduced that capability with the release of our U.S. sovereign cloud within Microsoft, Azure Government, and GCC High. And over the course of time, of course, there's been many questions about the compliance characteristics, if you will, of each of our clouds, especially if you're comparing and contrasting commercial to GCC versus GCC High. I've somewhat demystified that in several blog series that I have, so I'd welcome you to go and review, especially the understanding compliance between Microsoft 365 commercial, government, and DoD offerings is something of a golden standard that compiles and disseminates a lot of different articles that we have across Microsoft. To do just a quick brief review of that here today, Microsoft has the most trusted and compliant cloud. We have over 100 compliance regimes and regulations that we adhere to across the globe, including not just government regulations, but also industry and regional regulations. If we focus in on, of course, U.S. defense industrial base, that would include our U.S. government regulations that we have, everything spanning from FedRAMP High to of course, the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, the Cloud Computing SRG for the DoD, and of course, CMMC is the topic of conversation mostly today. If we really distill it down into a comparison between the commercial cloud versus the government cloud, there is a purpose-built environment with the U.S. sovereign cloud that we constructed to protect controlled and classified information. So that is Microsoft 365 Government GCC High, and it's pairing with Azure Government. So if you look at, for example, compliance with CMMC, we say that you can meet CMMC level 1 in both the commercial cloud and the government cloud, but to get the full set of data protections that are required, especially for export controlled data, CUI specified, would include ITAR, export controlled data, nuclear information, etc., then you would choose the GCC High environment. And you can see the breakdown here. We've got coverage for DFAR 7012, CMMC levels 1 through 3, ITAR, etc., within the GCC High environment. And we chose to position GCC High for the Exostar solution, specifically to have that higher watermark of compliance so that we could be able to establish an enclave that would be able to meet the full spectrum of coverage for controlled unclassified information, both CUI basic and CUI specified. Now, the other conversation that is typically after we've aligned GCC High as the coverage that you would have for protecting CUI in an organization, then the question then becomes, well, what's the quickest path to get to a compliant environment? Because the vast majority of the 80,000 DIB today that have and control or possess controlled and classified information do so in an on-premises enclave, right? So as we look to extend this out to the cloud and to leverage GCC High and Azure Government, the natural path for many of my customers is to choose to go to an enclave, and that would include standing up a designated subscription within Azure Government GCC High where you could host that CUI. And then, of course, you could be able to collaborate there within those boundaries. So you can see on the left side of this diagram, there's an illustration. Really, in the context of the Microsoft Cloud, you have your full enterprise IT environment in the commercial side or on premises, right? So that's represented with the blue color scheme. And then you can establish these enclaves that are designated for protection of CUI. Now, what we've also found is over the spectrum of time, working with many of, especially the larger DIB prime contractors, is that they need to elevate the posture of their entire enterprise IT system. So you'll see many of the DIB primes have shifted from left to right, where they initially would have enclaves set up and would ultimately migrate and establish an enterprise foothold within GCC High until such time that they may decide to just have and go all into GCC High for their enterprise. But the concept of this enclave still becomes relevant, right? So there's this North Star, this, I would say, motion that we've had with the CMMC acceleration program and working with various partners like Exostar to look at how we can be able to have an accelerated path to get to CMMC compliance, and to have a forum in which case you could be able to collaborate with your subcontractors, suppliers, and even with the DoD. And establishing this higher watermark for compliance inside of an enclave gives you a quick way to establish that, and with managed services to be able to wrap it around with a lot of the operational monitoring, incident reporting, et cetera, that gives you an opportunity to also uplift the compliance that you would have in collaboration with many of your subcontractors and partners and suppliers today that are non-compliant in their own IT systems. So the enclave is relevant not just for those commercial organizations that need to establish a CUI enclave, but also those that are already migrated into GCC High, that they can set up what we've kind of been calling these meet me tenants, right, or the extranet or the enclave tenants. Just to do a really quick rundown on what we mean by an enclave. So there's a quick principle that I'll make is a differentiation between shared data versus personal data. Pretty obvious, in this case, personal data in context of the enterprise. It's not Hotmail or Outlook.com. It's personal data for the enterprise, where you've got a user that has OneDrive for Business. They've got My Documents. They've got an Exchange personal mailbox they send and receive email from, and a SIP account, of course, for Teams. Versus shared data, where you've got unstructured file storage, may have a SharePoint team site, Teams, where you'd have the ability to share within a group. It may be Exchange public folders, etc. So in the context of the Meet Me, this is more of shared data, right? This is a shared data enclave, in which case you're able to establish a compliance boundary, a system boundary that would be in context of that particular enclave or that subscription within the cloud. So it is a logically isolated container for protecting controlled unclassified information. You have controls in place, such as conditional access, network isolation implementation, that would prohibit, for example, untrusted devices from connecting into that enclave, or looking at user authorizations that you can enforce certain caveats, such as U.S. persons, for the rule set that you would have for accessing information within the enclave, and of course policies that would help to protect from data exfiltration. So if you're designating storage of CUI within this enclave, then it would stay there. And there would be a governance policy or practice for being able to exfil that within the governance policy of the organization. So it often mirrors an on-premises data enclave, but the benefit here is you can hydrate it quickly, you can leverage managed services, et cetera, have a compliance package wrapped around it with the system security plan and so forth that would be the true panacea, if you will, for getting to that CMMC level 2 certification quickly. The one thing we do want to point out, though, is that the personal data in this context does still reside outside of that system boundary. So the user's Exchange mailbox and their OneDrive for Business, et cetera, may still be on premises or in a commercial side environment. So you have to have that right level of governance policies to protect CUI from spilling over. Put together this diagram sometime back in context of working with Exostar to really illustrate, especially for a industrial-based prime contractor that is currently homed within GCC High, that they may establish this Meet Me enclave and be able to leverage services such as what Exostar has with the Secure Access Gateway. So in this case, the solution will be described with the next speaker, with Vijay, but I just wanted to point out here that, it is able to not only provide guest level access coming in from external users at subcontractors, suppliers, et cetera, that are all authenticated through this cloud broker identity management, such as Secure Access Gateway, into the enclave that you see illustrated here in the top half of the diagram. And in this particular context, you have access to services such as Microsoft Teams and SharePoint Online. Now, leveraging technologies that Microsoft has, such as our B2B capabilities, you can also still collaborate, effectively with your enterprise tenant as well. So there are kind of a blend of strategies of being able to leverage GCC High enterprise tenants that are also going to collaborate with this enclave tenant as well. In looking at, just for those of you that are unfamiliar with Microsoft 365, the solution that is primarily being advertised in this first version of the Exostar solution for the defense industrial base does anchor on Microsoft Teams, and that would include collaboration, not just for file storage like you would traditionally do with a document library and SharePoint Online or within a team group, but you also have now the ability to establish meetings within that system boundary, to do chat and of course to collaborate with a secure environment, for which Vijay will describe here in just a moment. Before I move on, I also want to plug for next Monday, we do have a session that we're doing in coordination with Forrester for the total economic impact of the Microsoft Cloud. It's pretty timely for this session. I do invite you to come and participate with that and learn about the research that Forrester has done, especially in context with GCC High. If you can't click on the link here, but you can either find me on LinkedIn, or we can advertise the event link in the comments for the YouTube session. That was really brief. I wanted to leave enough time for us to do questions as well. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to to the moderator, to Vijay, and we can talk about the Exostar solution.
Great, thanks so much, Richard. So our next speaker is Vijay Takanti of Exostar. Vijay is going to cover Exostar's solution in more detail, so you can see how that fits together with obviously Microsoft, both GCC High as well as with Teams. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Vijay. Oh, can't hear you, Vijay.
Sorry, I was on mute.
There we go.
It was great. Thank you again, Kevin. It was great hearing from Bob and Richard. I think Bob laid out the case very well on the sense of urgency and the need for innovation to solve the problem that is facing 80,000 companies. It's a complex problem, as Bob mentioned, and the complexity only will increase when we bring in the concept of assessments going forward into next year. The good news is there is a solution, as Bob identified, and Richard gave us a good understanding of the technology that Microsoft has built and the capabilities they've built. Not only the capabilities in the platform, but the certifications they've achieved with FedRAMP High certification, which is the highest level of certification you can get in the US federal space. What Exostar has done, working with folks in Microsoft and with guidance from Bob, is provide a solution for our customers, primarily those customers who are not large companies. Obviously, large companies, the primes, as Bob mentioned, the Boeing, the Lockheed, Raytheon, they know how to solve the problem. As Richard mentioned, they have chosen to potentially move their entire enterprise into the cloud and protect all the resources in the cloud because the cloud offers the best solution for them. The question we are trying to tackle is how do we provide that same type of security for, I wouldn't say small companies, but companies who have a smaller footprint or number of users. And there may be a large company or a medium-sized company, but only few of the users in the company or few employees deal with defense data. Most of the other employees deal with maybe commercial data. If you look at Boeing, it's both a commercial enterprise as well as defense enterprise. Their suppliers do have a commercial and a defense business. So the question, as you can see, is how do we support the users who are actually dealing with the defense regulations, DFAR specifically, 7012 and the related specifications? How do we provide them an affordable solution? That's the topic we're trying to address. What Exostar has done is essentially take what we built today and integrate that with the GCC High solution that you heard Richard mention, such that we can provide a cost-effective solution. The other thing Exostar has done is it's a managed service. We're not just providing a technology capability, we're actually providing a managed service on top of the cloud platform that Microsoft is managing. Primarily aimed at the defense industrial base. So this managed service is built on the GCC High cloud, right? What does it do? It helps, at the bare minimum, it helps secure the CUI, the control unclassified information, to the levels that is required by the CMMC 2.0 compliance. In other words, our focus is primarily those 80,000 companies at level 2, and NIST 800-171 is the control set we're trying to meet there, right? The other thing, obviously, these companies not only have to meet the security controls, they will maybe audited, and they most probably will need assessments done once the interim final rule is announced by the Department of Defense. Our intent is to support our customers in the audit process, given that we've already done the investments to build the processes, the system security plan, the documentation that goes along with that. We want to provide that to our customers so they can go through the audit process expeditiously. And lastly, we want to remove, because it's not just building it and just forgetting about it, you have to. It's all about security. You heard Bob mention adequate security, right? And security is not a one-time job. You have to actually monitor it. You have to make sure when things change, your security profile is changing. So what Exostar is planning to do is not only provide you, as I mentioned, a technology service, but a solution which includes security monitoring and security mitigations we can take depending on the situation that we see. Obviously, much of that at the platform level is being addressed already by Microsoft with the GCC High solution. We'll be addressing whatever Microsoft is not addressing. As I mentioned, this solution is built on the GCC High, Microsoft GCC High Cloud. And what we've done, as you heard Richard mention, we've integrated our secure access. Many of you today may be using Exostar. You may be using Exostar to authenticate to Exostar to pick up your purchase order. If you are a supplier to Boeing, supplier to Lockheed, supplier to Raytheon, the list goes on. You want to pick up your purchase order, you want to submit an invoice, you log into Exostar, you do that. We want to take that same paradigm where you log into Exostar and instead of picking up your purchase order, give you another application where you can actually store CUI. And not just store CUI, we want you to be able to exchange CUI with your customers or your partners. Now, obviously, you may be thinking, hey, what does it mean to me? I deal with multiple customers, I deal with multiple partners. They may have different domains, email domains, do I need to change all that or to make any changes? The intent is not to have any changes. We will support multiple domains. At the same time, if the domain is a social domain like gmail.com, we will ensure that the user using that gmail.com address will be authenticated with two-factor authentication to comply with the NIST 800-171 standard. Right. The other thing, Microsoft GCC High is already FedRAMP High certified. Because the system boundary now includes Exostar in this solution. Exostar, we are getting our Exostar secure access FedRAMP moderate attestation done at the moderate level by September of this year. And lastly, it's not just about security and compliance. It's also about if an affordable solution is only affordable if your users can use it without having to call 10 people to know how to actually use the system. It's built on the Microsoft user experience. Many of us know how we use Microsoft on a day in, day out basis. We're building it on that user experience. And as Richard mentioned, Microsoft Teams is becoming ubiquitous. We are using Teams, especially in this COVID era that we are living. We use Microsoft Teams almost daily, whether to share information, whether to have meetings, whether to do chat. So we're using the same user experience and providing a compliant solution for all of you. So what are we solving? What's the problem at the end of the day that we are solving for you, right? As I mentioned, it's not just about protecting data. It's also about exchanging data. For example, today you heard the concept that Richard mentioned, personal data versus shared data. Typically, you may be getting an email with CUI attached with the email. That is a no-no in this new world. That's personal data. Your email data, as Richard mentioned, is personal data. But you still want to be able to share that. Your prime may want to share that document, whether it's a design document or some sensitive document with you. Using this Microsoft Teams environment, which is integrated with secure access with Exostar, you can invite your prime, your customer, to actually share that information in that Teams. So the document is actually stored in GCC High. It's not just stored, you can exchange. You can collaborate with your customer or your partner. The other thing, as I mentioned, is we do have a system security plan. We really don't know what the plan for a service provider like Exostar is from DoD. What is the certification we have to actually meet? Today, the rule of the land is you have the FedRAMP moderate equivalent, and that's what we're doing. But given that we are already meeting that high security compliance bar, we can provide you that information so that you can also meet your audits when you get assessed or when you get audited by DCMA, depending on the situation. And lastly, an enclave, as Richard mentioned, and if you look at NIST 800-171 introduction, they clearly say to have an affordable solution, it is better to isolate the information into a physical space or a logical space so that you can manage that information in that space with the most cost-effective solution. So that's what we're creating. We're creating an enclave which lets you isolate and store that information which has to be protected in that enclave. That enclave happens to be the GCC High Microsoft Teams tenant. And to access the tenant, you will have to log into Exostar to access. So it's as simple as you log into Exostar to get your purchase order, you log into Exostar to collaborate with Lockheed or Boeing or any of your other customers or your partners that you want to work with. With the assurance that that solution would definitely meet the CMMC 2.0 level 2 requirements. It will definitely address the requirements already spelled out in DFAR 7012, which requires NIST 800-171 110 controls compliance. And in the future, we know the DoD is coming up with the interim final rule. Our promise, because it's a managed service, is to make sure when we see the details of the interim final rule to keep the solution compliant with that interim final rule if there's any changes to what we see today. So you may be wondering, hey, this all sounds good. What do I have to make change? What changes do I have to make? That's another thing we're trying to focus on when we talk about affordability. We don't want you to make any changes. You have an email address, you can keep that email address. As long as you recognize that email is your personal data, you don't use that email to share information. You can use the email to share the links to information. The link may point to the Microsoft Teams enclave, that's fine. But to get to that information, obviously, we will enforce two-factor authentication, which is one of the difficult challenges we hear from our customer base when it comes to meeting NIST 800-171 compliance. The other thing we also hear is not, if we already are using Microsoft Commercial, why do we have to, why can't we use that system? As Richard mentioned, CUI also covers ITAR, and export control means that platform has to be managed by people who are US citizens or US persons, and GCC High meets that high watermark. So again, we're not suggesting that every employee in your company has to be able to use GCC High. We recognize that may not be economically feasible. So for limited users who need to access CUI, we are providing a solution you can use without changing any of your IT infrastructure. What do we mean by limited users? In this case, we are focused on any 75 or less number of users can use the solution. Right? If you have more than 75 users, we have different solutions, enterprise scalable solutions. We can talk about that in a later session. So what is the solution? So if you're using Microsoft Commercial, you already know Teams. You can use your commercial solution as it is to do your standard work, or if you're using on-premises, as Richard pointed out, you can use whatever tools you use to do your commercial type of work. When it comes to defense work, or when it comes to information that is labeled as UI or marked as UI, that information you want to make sure it is stored in the GCC High tenant, and you can only access it using the Exostar Secure Access. Together, we will get you that compliance that you need. The other thing we have done with this solution, we know it takes some time to build a solution and keep it up and running. You saw from Richard's slides that the solution GCC High is limited. They do validate, they do verify which customer can actually access GCC High in Microsoft. Working with Microsoft, this solution was built. We know the defense industrial base already connected to Exostar. They've already done the basic vetting of these companies before we connect them with the Exostar platform. With that underlying assumption, we can provide you a solution within 48 hours or less. The reason it's 48 hours is essentially we'll have to ensure the cloud system is actually provisioned with the information that we're collecting from you. And not only, again, as I said, Exostar is offering a managed service, which means technology, but also means, hey, we know that folks may not know how to use the solution. Today, we do provide online training. Our intent is to provide both online and virtual training for those customers who need it, as well as support your audits when you need us to support it. So you can rest assured that when you win new business or when you compete and for the bids, that you can rest assured the CMMC is not a requirement you cannot meet. That working with Exostar and Microsoft, that's an easy requirement for you to check off. What is our request today for you is you heard from Bob. He quoted the David McCowan. I have that specific quote. Department of Defense is looking at innovative solutions to solve the problem for the large scale. David specifically said 85 or 110 controls is a good baseline. We have our security office has done what is called the responsibility matrix. We looked at the 110 controls. We identified which controls we can meet working with Exostar and Microsoft. Which controls do we need our customers to actually implement? A good example of what we need our customers to implement is to access the system. If you're using your wireless access, that wireless access endpoint has to be protected. You have to have a password to access the wireless router. So obviously, you will have to implement that control. Exostar, we can't implement it because we can implement. Once you connect, we can make sure you have two-factor and all that. To access the wireless router, you need to make sure that the wireless router has a password. And many of you have that. That's not an that's not a difficult put in when it comes to controls. The difficult challenges are to two-factor and security monitoring and labeling. Those difficult challenges we are actually addressing. So as you can see, we do believe we meet 85 of the 110 controls. That's in self-assessment done by the Exostar Security Office, which is an independent entity. And we can provide you that documentation if you're interested. The other thing, we do have a demo on our website. If you go to a website, you can actually see the solution, how it works. We intend to set up weekly webinars where Kevin will be actually hosting them, and he'll be actually demonstrating the solution so you can actually see the solution if you're interested. We plan to do it on a weekly basis. So those of you who may not be able to make it 1 week can definitely attend the second week. Lastly, there were lots of questions we got. What do you mean by affordable? So what we mean by affordable is we're providing the solution at the price point you see on the slide. The minimum number of users we are starting with is 20 users, which translates to about 12,000 per annum. That includes everything I mentioned. It also includes the 2FA that you need to access the system. So it's as easy as going to the Exostar website and essentially purchasing the service, and in 48 hours, you're up and running. Most of you are already familiar with Exostar. You most probably purchasing the credentials at Exostar using the web store. It will be a very similar experience for those of you who already do that. So that, in a nutshell, is the solution. So with that, Kevin, I think that's my last slide. Oh, lastly, the last thing, this is the important slide. This is a solution we've definitely partnered with Microsoft. You saw the architecture blueprint that Richard shared about the Meet Me tenant, what he calls the Meet Me tenant or the Enclave tenant. That's what we've built working with Microsoft. And that's easy for you to use without any changes to your IT environment, right? And it's easy and affordable in the sense you don't have to migrate all your users in an enterprise to use the solution. So given those two levers, we believe it's a highly secure, because security is important. It obviously has to be compliant, but security is very important, as Bob pointed out. The threat vector is only increasing. We are seeing, you must have heard, FBI and MI6 both jointly having for the first time a joint presentation on the threats, especially from China, and that's only increasing. So working together with Microsoft, we believe we've created a highly secure solution, which meets that definition of adequate security that Bob described in the beginning of the meeting. At the end of the day, you can then provide the assurance to your customers that CUI, ultimately CUI that DoD has identified, is protected at the highest levels that DoD is identified. So that's our promise to you. So with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
Great. Thanks so much, Vijay. So I get set up here. And again, thanks, Bob and Richard and Vijay. Let me share. So before we go to the Q&A, just wanted to remind everybody that in the YouTube description, there is a link to an exit poll. We really appreciate everybody filling that out. As I mentioned before, we take these exit polls very seriously. We want to obviously see how we're doing for this particular one, but we also want to get your input on additional topics, new areas, et cetera, that you'd like to explore so we can plan for our next few sessions. And with that, let me go ahead and jump into the QA. So I kind of grouped our questions into 3 broad areas that as they came in. We had a couple questions on kind of general CMMC. We had some questions that were fairly Microsoft specific, and then we had some questions that were really solution specific. So I'm going to kind of go around the room, if you will, and kind of and bring each of these bring a question from each of those topic areas up, and we will answer as many as we can before we run out of time. So the first one is more general. And actually, Bob, I'll address this to you first, and then I'll get some input from the others in the room. So it says, if we're awarded a prime contract requiring a CMMC level, do I need to require my subcontractors have that same level as they complete work as part of this overall contract?
Not necessarily, but possibly. It has been DoD's general policy, as is well known, that the 7012 clause has to flow down to everyone.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that controlled unclassified information, in fact, is shared with everyone. So DoD has often said that primes and higher tier companies should be careful. In some cases, they can decide not to share CUI with a sub, or they can limit what is shared to a small and more manageable quantity. So to answer your question is it depends. If you need to share CUI with your sub, then they will have to adopt means by which they satisfy 7012 and eventually CMMC 2.0.
Great, thanks for that. That's a great nuance there, and I appreciate that clarification. Vijay, Richard, do either of you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Bob covered it very well. Thank you, Kevin.
Yep. So, Richard, this one's for you because it came in really focused on Microsoft itself. So, and I think you did cover this, but I just wanted to make sure it gets reiterated because it did come up as a question. So, as it says, so can you touch on how or if O365 commercial or M365 or Azure commercial can be used to meet these requirements? Several consultants have told us that commercial can be compliant if secured properly.
Yeah, there's two parts to the answer to this question. First and foremost is that we're looking at protecting the full spectrum of controlled and classified information in this solution. That would include CUI specified with export controlled data, ITAR, EAR, and other specified like nuclear, which is the higher watermark for compliance that would align with GCC High. Really the big, I would say, binary decision factor for commercial will have to do with DFAR 7012. Right, so we do not have assurances or attestation for DFAR 7012 in commercial, whereas we do in our government clouds. Great,
thanks so much. And Vijay, I'll give this one to you because it's solution specific, and since I've been covering the chats on our website, I get this quite a bit. So so our corporate email is set up with a non-Microsoft provider. Do I need to get a new domain, hence a new email address to utilize this solution?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. As I mentioned, you don't have to change anything to use the solution we're offering. The innovation we have done is mapping your identity using Exostar into Microsoft, so you get all the advantages of the Microsoft platform without changing your domain. In other words, you can keep your email, you will get email notifications from GCC High to your email that you have. You can use your email to log into Exostar, but the only way to access Teams is using Exostar. And when you use Exostar, we do the translation between your email to the actual identity we manage, and that's how we ensure that you're compliant. The key thing we ask is don't, as Richard mentioned, don't use your email to exchange CUI. The email is just meant for notifications, not for information. And information in the notifications will always reside in the Microsoft Teams tenant. We'll be publishing an implementation guidebook to make that more clear, but it will be definitely covered in our online training material that we will be having.
Great, thank you. Let's see. So the okay. So Bob, another one for you around the general CMMC topics. Oh, here it is. So it says our goal is level 3, but can we proceed incrementally? And do we know kind of when this certification or audits are going to start taking place?
Well, that's a great question. Level 3 is not fully defined yet for CMMC, but we know it would be based upon NIST SB 800-172. And there is now 172A out as well for assessment methods, as I recall. So the purpose of 172 and level 3 is to help companies deal better with advanced persistent threats. The 171 requirements were really never intended to deal with nation-state threats. They were not intended to protect against such threats, things that DoD might characterize as high-value assets. We continue to see vivid demonstration of the existence of nation-state threats, both from Russia and China. Those of you who do sensitive work for DoD or the civilian agencies certainly should expect that you will be encouraged at least and eventually required to show that you have stronger measures to protect against those APTs. That would be CMMC level 3. Can you proceed incrementally? My view is yes, definitely. In fact, the way that I recall that the assessment methodology lays out in CMMC is that just as you have to go from level 1 to level 2, you will be going from level 2 to level 3. I doubt you could satisfy level 3, however it finishes, without satisfying all of level 2. The other question was, when do certifications begin? Well, DoD knows there's a lot of companies out there. And so when the rule becomes final, they will begin to meter out which RFIs and RFPs have the new CMMC clause requiring assessments and certification. They are, of course, going to manage the number of assessments and certs required to the then present state of availability of C3PAOs. I think there are 12 who are now available. Perhaps in a year there will be 50. DoD absolutely will need to make important choices as to who is subject to assessment and certification first. I would expect, frankly, that they'll be looking to programs that involve sensitive technologies, key military missions, high value assets. And so those of you who are already thinking about level 3, it would be my prediction that you are more likely to see an assessment requirement and a certification demand sooner than others whose work may be less sensitive or less important to DoD and its missions.
Great, thanks so much for that, Bob. And look at our time. We've run out, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As I mentioned, if you'd like to reach out to Exostar, please come visit our website at www.exostar.com. There is chat available there if you click on the solution page for Exostar's managed Microsoft 365. You can also reach us via the email address you see below. And again, Bob, Richard, Vijay, thanks so much for your time today. And everybody, thank you for your time and attention. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.